Coming up, they say no news is good news, but in the case of Ben Simmons, we go ahead and break down why that may not be true as we take a look at the potential for how this roster can change in Brooklyn for both the quote third superstar and even some of the supporting cast as well. Coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Oh, yes, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there is Doug Norrie. He's the owner-operator of DFSR for all your daily fantasy sports rankings. From DraftKings to FanDuel, he's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And Doug, we're going to get into it, man, because right off the heels of yesterday's conversation where we're talking about Kevin Durant, the trade packages, we kind of walked into an interesting narrative around Ben Simmons and where we think he and the Brooklyn Nets organization stand as far as being a partnership going forward beyond a trade.
Yeah, this is something that started worming its way into my head when I was talking to Jackson Gatlin on Sunday for Locked On NBA, and we were talking about something else, and then Simmons came up, and I started thinking, we haven't really heard anything about Simmons, and then I kind of just worked my way into a total lather about it, because now, as we continue to talk about it, and as we've searched sort of for proof otherwise, we really haven't found any. And again, is this mountain out of a molehill territory? Kind of, except that when you have a new player on the team and you have superstars on the team and you have a team that, and an organization that seems like they would like to keep things together, when you haven't heard anything about a potential superstar on your team from other players at any point, it does start to get a little concerning. And I don't know. We'll go through some of the quotes that you were able to kind of drum up and around Simmons. It's not going, I'll give you a little cliff notes here. It's not going to make you feel super amazing, but about what, and hey, come at us and say, hey, this might not be anything, but for a team that's already under duress here and maybe in a little bit of distress around like what the core group of guys is, it's not amazing that you can't fall back on the guys get along, because like at least with KD and Kyrie, you can always be like, hey, at least it does seem like they've been friends and have been friends at some point. And you can still kind of tell yourself that story. You simply can't with Simmons.
And so I think you're right. And we'll find out. I think even some people said in the comments of yesterday, the Nets love having Ben Simmons, or they're going to be excited to have him move in the season. Maybe that's the case. But as you said, when we're kind of looking around for some tea leaves that we can try to read, I did find over on Nets Wire, there's an article there from Josh Matthews. Seth Curry was over in Australia taking a little tour of a Foot Locker over there. So, of course, you're going to get questions around Ben Simmons. And I'll just run through quickly the quotes when asked about how is Ben Simmons doing? What is the expectations for him first? And coming back from that injury, obviously, as well, Seth Curry said, there's always going to be challenges. Foremost, he has missed a whole season, and it's going to be challenging to get his rhythm back and playing basketball. That obviously makes sense. He went on to say, I don't know specifically what he has been through mentally. That's hard for me to comment on. But having that year off, having that time off, and competing and playing 5-on-5 basketball is just going to be hard. Just taking some time and getting reacclimated to playing at a high level of basketball. But at his specific talent level, he has all the skills. The Nets need him on the floor. Pause there before we go down. There's one more quote here that actually I think is a little bit damning. But the Nets are going to need him on the floor. This is actually going to be another part of the conversation we're going to have here. But just initially, that doesn't ring like someone who has an understanding of organizationally what the intention is here when Seth is answering these questions. It kind of sounds like what you would have said when they first traded for him. He hasn't played a lot of basketball. Be interested to see what he does. All those videos of him warming up and working out in the facility, it looks like it hasn't necessarily mounted to any definitive idea of just the state of where his game is, let alone what the expectations are within the team.
Does that sound like a guy who has played close to 1,300 minutes with Ben Simmons over the last 2+ years? Like, because when you think about, like they played 1,279 minutes together when they were with Philly 2 years ago. The lineups were awesome, by the way. 117 offensive rating, 107 defensive rating. So, I mean, Embiid was part of that group also. But does that sound at all to you like a guy that's played significant minutes with a guy who is now his teammate again? Would you ever guess that? Again, it's a Foot Locker stop. I get it. It's off the cuff. I don't know. Seth's great. This is not a dig at Seth Curry at all. But that to me, the quote already sounded bad when you read it to me off the line, because we were talking about it just a little bit before the show. I was like, geez, if you're trying to look for inspiration here, this isn't exactly it. Then before we start here, I'm like, let me just look up real quick how much these guys have played together. And it actually makes me even feel worse, because there's no reference to, I mean, unless we're just missed part of the quote, there's no reference to their time together in Philly. There's no reference how he, Simmons made him better. There's no reference to what he'd seen already playing with him. Hey, I know this about this guy. We were on the same team for a year. Like all this stuff that you could draw on sort of historically as having been teammates already, none of it is there. And to me, this is again one of those, what didn't you say? What didn't you say? The whole theme that we've been drawing on here that we're trying to suss out is what hasn't been said around Ben Simmons. Okay, great. He came to the team last year. The back was injured. He was dealing with stuff. He didn't get to really ramp it up with the guys. I can understand why Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving might not have a lot to have said about him. So their guys, Seth Curry played with him for a long time. And this is what you come up. This is such a formulaic answer. And it's really just not actually what happens when you feel certain ways, I don't think, around it. And I'll say too, like that's the most damning thing here. It's like they played, again, I'll just reiterate, 1,279 minutes of very good basketball together. And that is not mentioned at all from Curry as far as we can tell. And this speaks to some of my concerns. Let me just say one more thing, because I know everyone's going to come at me with this. I want Ben Simmons to be great. This is not some kind of takedown of Ben Simmons. The best thing for the Nets, the best thing for us as a podcast, the best thing for Nets fans everywhere is for Ben Simmons to be good. I want that to happen. That is the thing we all want to happen. There's just not some kind of hit piece on Ben Simmons. This is just a realistic view of what the landscape around this guy looks like, because I frankly am finding it just a little bit weird.
No, 100%. And I'll just wrap up here before we move into, because I think there's the Seth Curry piece of this and the roster piece of this beyond Ben Simmons. And we talk about wanting to hear some concrete voices on Ben Simmons or on the team. There's a reason why maybe we're not getting some of that information. The final quote here, and this is via Josh Matthews of Nets Wire, but also taking from a Melbourne Age news outlet over in Australia. The final statement was, the role-playing two-guard liked what he saw when Simmons was working out. Quote, I've seen him in the facility a couple of times. He continued, just like I said, he's been doing a lot of shooting, working on his body, and being in the gym. So from everything I've seen, hopefully he'll be out there and ready to go come training camp. Again, doesn't sound like someone who has a real intimate idea of what's going to occur. And really, you brought one of the key points is like also not someone that seems like he's speaking confidently on what Ben Simmons is and what he's capable of and what he knows he can do and what we can do together in Brooklyn, which I think we're going to talk about in a minute here, is what opens up a lot more of the speculation around what happens next, whether it's a trade for Kevin Durant. And then even beyond that, though, I don't think anyone from a player standpoint has a concrete footing on what the future looks like.
Yeah, and I'm totally with you. It just speaks so weird. It's just not the first thing. And I get that athletes are built different, and I get that, everyone wants to have very curated responses. You don't have to have curated responses when you're being complimentary, though. Like when you're being,
those are free. You can hand those out like they're candy.
Yeah, say nice things. Like you can always say nice things. It doesn't, like, that will not harm any narrative. That won't work against you ever. You can just say, you can always have a compliment to say around a player. That can always, it's the other stuff that you have to probably watch yourself with, but no one's ever going to dig you for just being complimentary about some guy. That's the easiest thing ever to do. So when it's hard to come by the compliments, it's hard to kind of, build yourself into a lot of confidence too. So like that. That was pretty good. We should take that one out. That kind of flowed off the tongue a little bit.
That's social media. Yep.
This is something else that you're going to get into. Built Bar Puffs, baby, delicious, indulgent, covered in chocolate, and wait for this one, they're actually healthy for you. They got the new cookie dough chunk puffs. That's because Built Bar has just made a commitment to staying with the flavors because they know the flavors are what are going to drive it, and they know they have the stats to back it up. The cookie dough chunk puff has only 160 calories, whopping 15 grams of protein. So you know you're going to be getting the good stuff. Go to built.com. You can snag a box for you and the family. I had the family actually texting me the other day because some of these came in the mail and they always run to the box and I wasn't home. Grabbed it ahead of time. Gave the ringing endorsement right there. Like I said, covered in 100% real chocolate. They're made with collagen protein. Your body absorbs more efficiently, provides tons of health benefits as well. You can eat something that tastes good and is good for you. Go grab that cookie dough chunk puff. Go to built.com. Use the promo code LOCKED15. Get your 15% off of that order. Use the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com.
So we're going to get into this roster potential turnover when we talk about a Kevin Durant trade, but quick pause on that to come back to why are we not hearing a level of confidence or a perspective from the organization or from the players? Now, the Kevin Durant piece makes all the sense in the world. I've requested a trade. What am I commenting on? But, if it doesn't work out and I have to be here, let me go ahead and break down what I think about this roster. However, Kyrie Irving has also not been engaged or, had any commentary around what the expectations are. We've heard reports from Shams Charania that he expects to be there with or without Kevin Durant. He wants to play out the next year. He thinks that he can still be a part of this organization going forward. But if that's the case, why aren't you hearing the reason why I want to be a part of this organization is because of what I think I can do with Ben Simmons? Obviously, I want Kevin Durant to be on this roster, but we know the nature of basketball, blah, 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 blah. I still think I can be a leader of this team going forward. It does feel like any narratives have had this very stagnant pause put on them because and this would be why players would say, why would it be damning for Kyrie Irving to come out and say how complimentary he is with Ben Simmons and how excited he is to play with him? Because maybe in 2 weeks he's traded and it's all a moot point, and maybe likewise for Ben Simmons as well. But those are the leaders is really the point that I want to get to. Those are the leaders of the team. Who are the vocal leaders of this team? If Kevin Durant is going to be traded, if Kyrie Irving might be traded, we don't know, right? So who are you looking to make definitive statements around expectations for this team is something else. Cam Thomas, right? Like who is supposed to speak up beyond the organization itself, Sean Marks and Joe Tsai?
Well, this has kind of always been a slight issue that I think fans and folks could kind of stick out there in terms of the Nets is that they really haven't had a vocal leader in a while, right? Like they've had great players, but there's never been like sort of a guy that you would look to that like they don't have any rah kind of guys. You don't always need them. It's okay. But if you think about some of the other teams that we've seen, where they have just like irrational, it's like has been put out there, irrational confidence guys, or just like, look at Golden State. It's clearly Draymond Green, right? And then everyone looks to Seth because he's so great. That's kind of works in tandem. And then like LeBron James,
Draymond not being the best player, but it's understood he's the guy that's the vocal communicator around this team.
Correct. Like LeBron has always been a guy, like a leader in that kind of floor general kind of way that like as part of his game. Like you look at other teams, guys like Kyle Lowry was like that when they had Kawhi, right? On the championship run. Maybe Kawhi wasn't the rah-rah guy, but they got Kyle Lowry in the team that you kind of a veteran presence that you kind of have right on the ball. Celtics felt like they had a couple of those guys last year, right? Like they had a few guys that kind of took on the mantle of having some personality around the team. That's really not something the Nets have had in this current iteration since these guys came in the door. It's not mattered so much at times because they've been really good. And when they had Harden, they were so good that you didn't really need anyone to be that kind of vocal dude. And they had a floor general in Harden that kind of made things work. But we saw last year, specifically against the Celtics, that there was no one there kind of doing that. They were desperate for this. Right? They were desperate for someone to sort of step up into a leadership role beyond just the play, right? Like we know Kevin Durant can do it with his game. That's not in question. He's the leader of the team when he plays. He'll always be the leader of any team that he plays because he's just so good. But in terms of like that presence and identity around the team, and I really hate using the word identity because it's such a nebulous word that everyone can just use whenever they want to prove or disprove. They can just prove it. Everyone uses it to prove or disprove whatever they think, right? Like they say the identity, they don't know what it means. They're just using it to like try to describe some kind of feeling they have around the team. I'm saying that because I'm about to use it, but like they have not had really, but they haven't had that, right? They haven't had this definitive way to look at the team, this complete hierarchy, this guy that, the leader. And when Durant goes to the door, I really don't know who it's going to be. This does not give you any sense that it's going to be Simmons. Kyrie, I'm just not sure he's made for it. Like, he's a great player too, but there's not a lot of evidence that he's that guy either. And it does give you concern that there's no single piece or a few pieces that are sort of like have ever brought this team together. And that actually could be a big problem why we're in this problem now, right? Like, look at the Suns. It's like it's Chris Paul, right? He's like the floor general. He's going to dictate what happens. He's the leader. Nets haven't had that. Maybe this, as much as anything, is a reason Durant wanted out. And when Harden walked out of the door, he looked at Ben Simmons and said, he's not that guy, right? He's not that kind of leadership type. And it makes a lot of sense if you start thinking about it that way.
This is what's fascinating about, because I always think about when players go to team up, right? Understanding it's not just the talent level and whether or not it fits together, or looking at three guys and saying, how are these three guys going to be able to share the ball? Well, the on-court stuff will work itself out, but then who is going to take on these different roles beyond the basketball court, and why it may become a little bit of an issue. And you, just to go NBA global for a second, you mentioned a team like the Phoenix Suns. It's obviously Chris Paul. It started making me think about some other teams that have been highly competitive, but maybe haven't been able to get over that hump. Like the Dallas Mavericks resonate like a team like that for me. Luka Doncic doesn't strike me as the vocal leader. Clearly the absolute number one best player on that roster, and maybe some of what they did this past year. Now they lose Brunson, but even when they brought in like Spencer Dinwiddie, I can go back to, and he's not that guy per se, but he was always very comfortable speaking on the team, speaking on the identity word, right? And being someone that you could put the mic in front of, and he wasn't shy or lacking for confidence to speak as someone who knew how to frame what their team was, what they were going to accomplish. I think about that from an NBA perspective of like, if you're a team that thinks you're right on the cusp, this is a component that is beyond the talent, beyond just having the skill on the court to win a championship, is how do you have a guy that sometimes in a lot of ways takes the pressure off of your best player, right? He's the guy that'll give you the sound bites. Draymond Green will take all the pressure off Steph Curry if he needed it on a game-to-game or on a season-to-season basis. Some teams maybe lack that, and you lose in the margins because it's not a stat that you can quantify on how it impacts your team.
Yeah. And again, this is one of those like the word quantify is the perfect word. This is a very difficult thing to quantify. It's hard. You have to sometimes watch a team a lot to sort of understand if it's happening or not. Winning cures a lot of this. And you don't think about this very often when they're winning. That can be a chicken or egg thing. They did not have this guy that much when it was the Harden, Kyrie, Durant thing. They didn't need it. The talent was overwhelming. So no one cared. We never mentioned this, right? We never mentioned it. It's much easier to mention this stuff when things aren't going well, which is why I don't always trust when people mention it, right?
Because, by the way, too, it's like this would be pre-superstars when the Nets were going on those runs. You weren't even talking about who was a vocal leader, but because no one was a superstar talent, the collective, gosh, man, how many times this is the word of the day. The collective identity of that team, though, was scrappy, gonna fight you tooth and nail, right? A gritty team. So that was the collective identity because there was no singular talent that clearly rose above the rest. That makes it easier to lean into that. Whereas right now, if you look at this roster and you say, let's just say all these players, the superstars are gone. Is there any player, and even include, and we can come back around to this in a minute, whether it's a Scotty Barnes, a Jaylen Brown, a Brendan Ingram, any of the names even being thrown out there in some of these trade discussions, who's going to be that guy potentially going forward for the Brooklyn Nets if their vision is to still be a competitive team beyond losing some of these stars?
Well, here's the other thing. It doesn't really matter when you're not a championship contender. Right? Like, so like it matters a whole lot less when you're not a championship contender, because there you're just kind of fighting for seeding and trying to, win some for the fans, and maybe, steal around in the playoffs or something like that, a la those Nets teams you were talking about before. There's a reason I only pick the championship level teams to give examples for with that, because this is really where it only starts to matter. At the end, when you don't have championship level talent, it's like, hey, let's just hope for some W's, and and they're an exciting team. When you're trying to break into the next level, that's why those teams that who's the vocal leader of the Hornets? Hey, who cares? Right? Like it doesn't matter. Who cares? Like, they're a nice team, fun team to watch.
If only they were vocal leader, how much further could they have gone?
Doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah.
I'm sure they have one. Like, I'm sure it's
right.
Like, Gordon Hayward at times or something, whatever. Like, it was Terry Rozier. I'm sure there is. It's just, I'm saying is we're not going to sit here and talk about it, because who cares? Like, if they punch a little above their weight, all good. If they don't, all good too. Doesn't matter because there's no expectation. It's only when that expectation is leveled on you that you start to actually, like you said, have these final pieces to put together. You need this final thing to get you over the hump, to bring your organization together, to take the lumps if one of your superstars is getting, it handed to them, or you need to take the pressure off. Then you actually need those guys. The other ones you don't, and the Nets really never had it. And I will say now, even coming back, my guess is they still don't have it. Even if this team came back totally whole, they still wouldn't have that guy.
And that's why coming up here in a second, as yes, we unfortunately can only push the pause on would they have a leader if nothing changed? Most likely not. But what does the landscape of this roster turnover look like? Are there even viable teams interested in Ben Simmons? And what is the fallout from making big moves as you only have a finite number of roster spots to go into the season with? Okay, so let's start with the first piece, just since we're talking about Ben Simmons so much, before we touch back into a potential Kevin Durant trade. Ben Simmons, like you mentioned it almost briefly yesterday, the Kings had shown a little bit of interest, but it almost feels like maybe they've moved in a different direction. They have now Mike Brown there. They look like they're finally willing to say, we got to kind of rebuild what we are, or whatever we were. Do you think there are even viable teams if the Brooklyn Nets said, hey, we're moving off all of this? He's under contract. The value is low. It's a mystery where his game is right now. Are there even teams that would want to take a flyer on him? Even if the Nets were willing to take 50 cents on the dollar in return, do you think a team would be out there that would be interested?
No, not really.
Okay. So next up,
go check out YouTube. No, no, I don't think there is. I think actually the best chance that they have is a somewhat obvious move of Simmons. The best chance they have to move off Simmons, if they wanted to, is the same thing that would probably entice them to keep Simmons, which is that he comes back out in the beginning of the season and plays awesome, right? Like shows that the back's not an issue, show that he's at least, not even that he's developed any of his game, that he's at least back to what he was 2 seasons ago. Mm-hmm. Like I'm not, forget the 3-pointer, forget like all that other stuff that people have always dreamed on that he's shown no real willingness or want to like add to his game. Forget that. Right now, they just need him to get back to what he was in 2021. That would be a win because he's not there right now. I don't think the stock is as low as some would have you believe, but it's certainly not high, and it's certainly not high compared to his contract. The very best thing that can happen for the Nets right now, and this is actually Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving independent. It's not actually the fate of these guys doesn't really tie that much into this part of what it does for Simmons, which is if Kevin Durant's back, he needs to play well. If Kevin Durant's not there, he needs to come back and play well. That's the only way to rehabilitate the trade value at all. And again, I'm not even like, hey, don't miss your free throws and don't take threes. Just get back to like the defensive guy, the transition guy, the good read and react guy when he would start rolling to the rim, the guy who could blow past sort of smaller defenders and finish up and around them at the rim. Like he's a huge, huge plus when he's rolling well. We just are so far removed from it, and the last taste in everyone's mouth is really bitter around his performance. He just needs to if he gets back to that guy, then I think we can start having the conversation. I don't think it's even worth. I don't think anyone's calling, and I don't think the Nets can call anyone about him either.
Well, and to your point about if he comes back and looks good, this would be the one way you know exactly how the Nets feel about Ben Simmons all the way back to the trade is if he comes back and looks like Ben Simmons that we currently know him to be when he's been healthy, and you get to the trade deadline and you hear the Nets are shopping him, well, then there you go. Because then that means the Nets never really had an intent of going forward with him in any iteration. Obviously, Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving can play a factor in that. But if he looks good, it might be the reason why they don't trade him because he looks good and he's only 25 years old. So why would you move off that asset? The other thing, though, and it actually would tie into him as well. He could look good going to the deadline. The Nets say, we know we're kind of in a rebuild. We can get value for him. We're going to get back 2, not superstar talent players, 2 nice younger role players that we think can be good pieces. That's 2 bodies. Kevin Durant gets traded before the deadline, and it's going to be a 3-player plus a couple of picks. Okay, that's 3 bodies. And overall, you're talking about adding 5 or 6 players relative to 2 guys that you're sending out. You can put Kyrie into that mix as well. When you look at this roster where we all began, you got Seth Curry and you have Joe Harris. There's been rumors that maybe Joe has kind of said, I wouldn't hate going and playing somewhere else at this point. I'm a sharpshooter on the perimeter. If I'm going to lose the stars, my life becomes a lot harder. I'd be better off somewhere else. Those seem like the first 2 logical names that maybe would go because they're holdovers and Seth is on a reasonable contract in the final year of his deal. But where else would you look on this roster and say, that guy, like you're going to be gone, because the Nets may have to open up 3 or 4 roster spots in order to accommodate, potentially, we would hope, the quality talent they'd look to get back. It's a good problem to have, but I also, like, my mind immediately went to, so which one of these young players that we talk about, dreaming on what their game could be, to go, oh yeah, Day'Ron Sharpe, he's gone. Or, what I mean, Kessler Edwards, whoever it may be, you go, that might be somebody that you thought highly of and just is not going to be a part of the future, even if they are talented. I think maybe Nicholas Claxton is an obvious one as well.
Yeah, I mean, they can move off Sumner's contract because that's not all
Yep.
guaranteed. So that wouldn't be a massive hit. That's the first guy to go. That's a flyer. He's on a rehab thing. The money's not guaranteed, even though they signed him to the contract. So he could go off the books without taking a hit. I think again, this is why they're keeping roster spots open for this thing. It's why we talked a couple episodes ago about the roster being incomplete, because it still is, because they can't make a complete roster without risking having to take a tax hit on just having to cut a guy. So I think they'll avoid any of that, any having to make a real tough decision about that stuff. I think they would probably work it. They could always just like plan to release someone also. Like I think there are ways to release someone that's coming in from the trade if they're just making the money work. I think there are multiple ways for this to work out for them. So I'm not so concerned about that part of it, but I think it is a big reason why we still see this roster as far from complete, because they have to keep those spots open or else they're in a really tricky spot.
And maybe let's even go a step further and frame it a different way. Not about creating roster space, but about reshaping what this roster looks like and having a balanced roster. Because I think you're right. No. I asked the one the way that you answered it was the response to my question, and it makes sense. Maybe we don't need to be worried about that. But what players aren't going to fit in the same way you might envision them around superstars, as opposed to, now we know we have TJ Warren, we know we have Royce O'Neal, right? Like we have this young core, but are there pieces inside of this that you look at and go, yeah, you don't matter nearly as much as you did when we're a superstar driven team?
I mean, some fans aren't going to want to hear this out there, and I'm sure this might
say
hit
Cam
hard.
Thomas, guys.
Well, I'm just not as high as on some of these rookies as I think other people are. And so it's not like unfathomable to think that these guys just aren't part of the future no matter what. Right. I haven't seen enough from any of them. Cam clearly can score at the level, and that's probably good enough to just hang no matter what. The rest of his game is so incomplete at this point that it's hard to, you can think about him as a nice to have. And he's the only one that's even close. The rest of these guys could all just go.
Kessler Edwards in this summer league was not a good foot forward.
They've all been nice stories. It's all nice stories. I'm rooting for every single one of them. I want them all to be good because that helps the Nets. I just think that there's an unrealistic attitude toward what their floor for a lot of these guys is right now, and definitely what their ceiling is. Like Cam's a great example of where I think my ceiling on him is so much lower than a lot of other people, because again, he can do one thing pretty well. He can't do a lot of things even at an average level right now. And like, that's concerning. So I think most of my answer is like, if these guys weren't part of the future, that's not the worst thing ever for the Nets from a talent standpoint, because it's not like any. But do you see that? I mean, does that being too harsh? Cam shot like 27% from 3 last year. He can't catch and shoot the ball. He like refuses to do it. There's holes in. Forget about the defense and forget about the other parts too, like the ball distribution, which we saw a little uptick in the summer league. But there's so many holes in his game that I do think people at times are blinded by the high volume, high usage, the ball goes in weird spots kind of thing, that I do think it blinds people to the rest of the game. So anyway, not to go crazy on Cam Thomas here, but my point is that I'm just lower on the young guys than I think a lot of other people are.
And I think we'll close out on this note of, you go back to losing Jarrett Allen, Day'Ron Sharpe is not the prospect that Jarrett Allen was as he was coming along for the Brooklyn Nets. And even then, you're still dreaming on what his ceiling was going to be. Ironically, like maybe Day'Ron Sharpe I'd be very excited to watch him play to see if his game has evolved to a new level. To your point, I think and this is, I mentioned yesterday, the Band-Aid getting ripped off could be a lot longer of a process than maybe Nets fans realize. It's not as simple as, well, the stars get traded, we get back pieces, and then we have all these other young guys. No, it may be another year later when you start to realize, what is Cam Thomas? What is his ceiling? Yes, he's a scorer. There are a lot of guys that can score the basketball. It's about everything else that goes along with it. So I think the mentality of let's finish whatever, and I'm a part of it. Like, let's just have whatever's going to happen here and move forward. But I also know that moving forward could mean losing 3, 4, 5 guys that are young. We have been talking about being talented and contributing, but also are not going to be the next iteration of the best version of a young core that you want to move forward with. It's why the Nets are asking for so much young talent in these trades for Kevin Durant, because they look at their own and they say, these are not good enough pieces to by themselves be what we move forward with. We're going to need someone like a Scotty Barnes that we can dream on, or a Jaylen Brown that can lead a young team as someone who has a proven pedigree to do it at a high level. So I tend to agree with you. It's a little bit depressing maybe, but hey, that's the way it goes sometimes, friends.
Look, these things can change quick. It's not that like it can change quick. And I'm not sold on it. I'm not, making a very definitive statement. I'm mostly just saying, like, ask yourself, how close do you think Cam Thomas is in closing a playoff series right now?
I think you're right to lower the expectations here.
Like,
it
just
seems
think about
like
it from
the
that
expectations
standpoint.
are rising. Yeah.
Like, the expectations are going to rise when he drops 30 in Summer League because it looks amazing. I get it. Think to yourself, how close is he to closing playoff games in the playoffs? The answer is very far, very far. Like, he's not close to that. Like, he's not close to that right now. Maybe a couple of years he can be with the development of his game. But if you think about it in context like that, you start to actually look at a more holistic view of his game rather than just getting starry-eyed around all this other stuff. And I think, frankly, I will say, I do think a guy like Ben Simmons actually would help him. Like, I think that is a good complementary piece for a guy like him, just because he can take off some of the ball handling duties. He can find him in space. He could loosen some defenders by going to the rim. I think that would be a good spot. Whereas, like, I don't know if guys like KD and Kyrie are good complementary fits for a guy like Cam, because they need to have the ball a lot, and that just means he doesn't have the ball and he needs the ball. So I'm
going to turn that vibe around, Doug. Love it.
Yeah, no, I'm mostly just saying, like, I'm just not as high, and I wanted to wrap Ben Simmons back into it. Okay, we're gonna get out of here. Make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. Appreciate all the comments rolling through the summer. Look, the summer's gonna go on. NBA news is gonna be where it is. We're gonna be here basically every single day. So make sure you go check out YouTube. Make sure you like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts as well.
Things change fast, day by day, moment by moment. But hey, more awkward for you guys. At least I still had my clothes on. Luke from the soap opera As the World Turns.
Oh, one of the all-time terrible shows. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.